Thank you for joining today's webcast on ransomware, hacking, and data breaches. What are you doing for your protection? My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director of NCPERS. Today's program is part of our expanded Center for Online Learning. As we all adjust to the new COVID reality, please bear with us if there should be any technical issues or unplanned background noise during our session. As always, your patience and understanding is appreciated. We encourage audience participation. Please submit questions by using the GoToWebinar portal. However, to ensure that we can cover all our topics today, we will hold your questions till the last part of the program. Additionally, in the handout section, you will find a PDF of today's presentation. Today's webcast is sponsored by Segal. To introduce his firm and today's webcast, we have Andrew Sherman. Andrew is Senior Vice President and National Director for Public Sector for Segal. Andrew, the session is yours.
Thank you, Hank. Hello, everybody. It is our pleasure to be sponsoring today's session. Segal is a consulting firm dedicated to providing trusted advice that improves lives. We have a particular specialization in public sector and in public sector retirement plans, and we are very proud of our long-standing relationship with NCPERS and ability to sponsor today's session, as well as a number of other sessions in the series coming up. Today's topic is one that is really top of mind for everyone, and we are noticing it even more intently as we are all working in this remote environment and likely to do so for a little while longer. It is really something that is happening everywhere and something that is a growing concern for plan sponsors, for governments, and in fact, everyone. And you are about to hear a lot more from my colleagues about this subject, the risks, and what plans are doing about it. And hopefully you'll have a couple of things that you can take away as well. Two of my colleagues are on, Amy Timmons and Diane McNally. Amy is a FSA and a Vice President and Senior Consultant in Segal's Consulting, Administration, and Technology practice. She has more of 25 years of experience delivering technology differentiated solutions to all types of clients and public sector clients in particular. She has an incredible ability to understand and communicate solutions that meet organizational and operational needs by leveraging her expertise with process and technology. And Diane McNally is a Senior Vice President with Segal and heads up our Segal Select insurance practice. Diane has a vast knowledge of insurance products and services and is an expert in many core products, including cyber liability insurance. She's a recognized leader in the field and has held several underwriting and leadership positions, and it's terrific to have her with us at Segal. And with that, let me turn it over to Amy. Thank you for joining us, and again, thanks to NCPERS for allowing us to sponsor today's session.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Amanda, if you'd go to the next slide, please. You can skip past our pictures, thank you. Here's the agenda for today. We will go over the facts. We'll talk some about social engineering. We'll talk about business continuity planning and the importance of that. We'll touch on best practices for being prepared in any kind of incident. We'll talk about due diligence and cyber insurance. We'll talk about training, and we'll give you some summary. So next slide, please. And we'll skip facts, only the facts, and go on. So what you should know about ransomware, and you can see here are just some recent incidents I pulled in the last month and a half, 2 months that have happened. They are ongoing. If you ever want to know what's happening in ransomware, just Google recent ransomware attacks and it'll pull up a wide variety of these. I focused on some of the more interesting ones to me. But what you should know is ransomware anymore is big business. There is a lot of opportunity. It's not just targeted on particular health plan data anymore, but kind of any protected information can be sold to somebody for something. There is easy access in that small organizations typically don't have the security tools in place due to, frankly, budget restrictions lots of times, while larger organizations can be so complex that they can't keep everything up to date. So there is a lot of opportunity and ease of access in that regard. It's a low cost of entry if you want to get into the ransomware business. There truly is ransomware as a service for $10 a month if you want to sign up and do it. So that in it of itself encourages people to do it. There is flexibility, and there are hundreds. There's like 1,800 at last count, almost 1,900 different variants of ransomware that allows you to do it. So protecting yourself against one strand of ransomware doesn't ensure that you have protection against all the other kinds. And part of that is you have to protect yourself against every single version of it, while the hackers only have to succeed once. There is also a low risk to the hacker to doing ransomware. They generally don't get caught. So you're seeing this continue to increase as it becomes more popular and a way for hackers to gain money. Next slide, please. Sorry, I have a delay here. So here's some statistics. I'm an actuary, as Andrew said. I like statistics. What you can see from these statistics are organizations are seeing higher ransom and increased impacts. You know, overall, criminals are succeeding in encrypting the data up to 73% of the time in these attacks. So they are being very successful in the ransomware attacks. What you need to ask yourself is, can you afford to be completely shut down for 15 days, unable to do anything electronically? That's key in some of your responses to ransomware. Next slide, please. Again, more statistics, and no, it's not a typo because I get asked that all the time. The average cost for a ransomware attack to recover from it is over $700,000 if you don't pay the ransom, and $1.4 million if you do pay the ransom. Exactly opposite of what you might think. It is more expensive to pay the ransom. Why? Mostly because you're just delaying what you ultimately have to do. Whether you pay the ransom or not, ultimately you're going to restoring from backups. You're going to be replacing hardware and software if you're smart, and you're going to do all those same activities under either scenario. When you pay the ransom, you just delay the pain and extend it out. That incurs additional costs, and that's why you see it almost doubling when you pay the ransom. Next slide, please. Last slide of statistics. Public sector organizations particularly. 5% said paying the ransom did not lead to the data being decrypted. So not a bad percentage, but if you fall in that 5%, you have issues. Also, 13% were never able to restore their data. To emphasize the importance of this, globally, studies are showing that 45% of public sector organizations were hit by ransomware last year. Now that's globally. Fortunately, a lot of those weren't in the US, a lot being a truly quantifiable term, but many of them were not in the US. Still, 45%, that's a very high percentage of attacks. Moreover, 56% of the organizations restored their data from backups, and only 26% restored their data from paying the ransom and decrypting their data. So again, the importance of having the backup, particularly for ransomware, is critical. Next slide, please. So a takeaway out of the ransomware is that, no surprise, ransomwares are increasingly focused on public sector and are costly. Moving on, social engineering. Next slide, please. So what is social engineering? Most of you have probably heard of phishing and tailgating or piggybacking. Those are fairly common. Next slide, please. Pretexting farming, and I like how social engineering tends to use a PH instead of a F, but farming, all of these categories or groupings under social engineering play on people's natural tendency to trust. So whatever the version is, whether it's somebody trying to get in the door with you or somebody impersonating a trusted figure, it all plays back to our natural tendency to trust what we see in front of our own eyes. Next slide, please. So this is one of my favorite examples because this actually was tried on me. You get a social media friend request on Facebook, or it could be LinkedIn. You know, I want to link with you. You see this picture. I'll focus on the one on the left. You know, Tammy, somebody is asking me for a friend request. I'm looking at the picture and I think, you know, that looks like my old high school classmate, not the same last name, but, you know, they get married. I changed my last name, got married, so it could be so-and-so. Sure, I'll accept it. Or bottom right corner, look at it. Oh, is that my friend's kid? You know, I haven't seen him in a couple years. He'd be about that age. Yeah, it could be him. You don't know. Next slide, please. What you do need to know is that all of these are fake images. They are completely computer generated or artificially intelligent, AI generated, artificial intelligence. These are images. Voice is already there in that artificial voice. Animation's not far behind. My favorite example of this kind of hack, and it wasn't even malicious, was the 17-year-old who generated a fake congressional candidate in Rhode Island, the state, that was certified by Twitter and Ballotpedia as a legitimate candidate. Didn't do it maliciously. He was bored, wanted to test and see if he could do it. He did. So you need to be even more aware than you were before. Next slide, please. So again, another example. First reported case of AI voice hack occurred over a year ago. Not in the US, over in Europe, where the hackers convinced the CEO of a UK company to transfer $240,000 based on the voice approval or voice request from their parent company CEO. Claimed they recognized the accent and the melody of his voice. Well, you know, and that made the news, and then the copycats started. As a person, you know, voice recognition is not 100% infallible as a human. We all like to think we recognize those voices, we're very good at it. However, growing up, I can't remember the number of times I answered the phone and people thought I was my mom or my sister. You know, so it has happened for many years that we're not as good as we think, you know. Now it's just being done with artificial intelligence. So again, you have to be questioning things if they don't make sense. Next slide, please. So how does this all affect your organization? Well, the tailgating, the piggybacking, it's less for a public sector plan. It's less about the physical access to your sites. That tends to be more the research institutes, the federal level. I used to work for Hewlett Packard. We had very strong requirements about tailgating because in fact, people would try it on occasion. It is more about the email. You know, 90% of malicious software comes from email. That is your biggest hurdle to overcome in most people. US is the most expensive country in the world for a data breach. You can see we're over twice the cost on average globally. That's due to we have federal laws, we have state laws, we'll have local laws that all require fines, mitigation strategies, penalties when something like this happens. And we take a very extensive approach to providing that mitigation for a data breach. So it doesn't come cheap. It also, if you look at that last bullet, takes public sector almost a year to address. So imagine the damage somebody can be doing in your system, the information they can get access to, the changes they can make, the things they can do if they're having free reign in your system for over a year. It's pretty scary. So it is something that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. So takeaway, social engineering, just like ransomware attacks, they're becoming more sophisticated, they're harder to detect, and they're expensive. So let's talk about business continuity planning, because that is one of your first lines of defense for those things. There are generally, and next slide, I'm on slide 19. There are generally 3 types of plans when you look at this that address some component of a security incident, as I'll call it. First, there's the crisis management plan. You'll also hear it called the incident response plan. Think of this as your emergency evacuation plan. You know, when the alarms go off, what's your path out? That's what you need to think about for that crisis management plan. The disaster recovery plan, the bottom bullet, is really about replacing the physical aspects, the infrastructure, the foundation of your organization or your system in that regard. And finally, kind of at the heart of it is that business continuity plan, which is the recovery. It is the recovery of your business processes and your organization and getting back to normal, or as normal as it will be. Next slide, please. So what do you do to ensure a business continuity plan is in place? The first thing you need to do is identify essential, postponed, and interrupted functions and focusing on the essential. What are the things you have to do to get for your business? Usually it's get the pension checks out the door, get people allowed to retire, collect the contributions. Those are your critical functions that you need to be able to do well, and get up first and foremost in any situation. Then you can look at kind of postponed. Okay, these we can delay a little bit. One of the things we're seeing with public sector plans is board meetings. You know, they could delay a board meeting, but there's a point where you have to have that board meeting to make decisions and move things forward. So postponed board meetings are now becoming priority. We've postponed them as long as we can. Searches for vendor searches, RFPs, those things, again, you can delay, but if your contract is ending, you need to, with that vendor or for that particular service, there is a requirement that you go out to RFP sometimes that you need to comply with, and you can't postpone it any longer. It has other repercussions down the line, but those are the kind of things where you look at postpone. And then interrupted, whether you ever decide to do them again, or they can be indefinitely postponed until you're back up and running like normal on your essential and postponed functions. You also need to look, as that first sentence says, of 40% of a workplace may be absent. So you need to mitigate physical absence. And I'm sure a number of you already addressed this for COVID when you could no longer be in the office. So that one may already be addressed in that regard. Next slide, please. So common business functions to evaluate. You know, when you're looking at essential, go through your organization, whether you go through department by department, and in each one say, you know, what are the priorities for this department? You know, what are the priorities for finance? What are the priorities for customer service? What are the priorities for benefits? Go by department or go function by function. You need to still go through and categorize essential, interrupted, postponed. Next slide, please. Takeaway, I'm sure you could guess. Ensure your mission critical business functions have been appropriately evaluated and categorized. Essential, interrupted, postponed. Actually, essential, postponed, interrupted. Wrong word. So next slide, please. So best practices for being prepared. Next slide. If you look at a risk and vulnerability analysis, this is one of the first things we recommend clients do. You need to turn over every rock in your organization. Yes, there's a lot on this list. Yes, it's not something you can just do overnight, but you need to go through and just look at each of these and, you know, identify all your assets, identify your business environment. Go through line by line and figure out how you're going to address those. You need to decide what is protect. You need to look at what to detect. You need to respond, and you need to recover. Next slide, please. One of the people are always going, well, yeah, that's great, but how do I do this? Department of Health and Human Services recommends using a risk matrix. We see a lot of clients who use this. On the one axis is the impact, on the other axis is the likelihood, and you start to put things in the different boxes along, you know, how likely is it to happen, and what's the impact. So the loss of an encrypted thumb drive or USB drive with confidential information is highly likely, but it is a low impact because it's encrypted, if it's encrypted well. The loss of an unencrypted thumb drive with confidential information is highly likely still, but also now has a high impact, and you need to address that immediately. Those are the kind of things that you prioritize and get a list, because that list will be long. And again, you need to kind of put your focus and put your money on the highest priority items. Next slide, please. But as I alluded to, our budget is limited. Everyone's budget is limited. Nobody has unlimited funds to spend on security, to spend on all of this. We get it. However, our argument or our point that you should remember is, according to the American Bar Association on February 11th, 2020, in their Mitigating Your Business Risk Board Responsibilities in Cybersecurity, to quote, directors and officers have a duty to oversee an organization's management of its cybersecurity risks. Instituting, updating, and monitoring systems controls is key to avoiding personal fiduciary liability. You need to hold yourselves to an acceptable standard of care, which is the phrase they're using now, and weigh these factors to, again, determine what's the risk, what's the impact to your organization, what should you spend your limited funds on, and prioritize. Next slide, please. So what can organizations do? Some of the best practices to protect are listed here. You know, scan, again, a lot of this is based on experience when we do these types of assessments and work with our clients. And reading any of the other sources of information, you will find very similar themes. You know, scanning external and internal networks, know where your valuable data is. It's frequently people will not know, oh, well, Amy maintains a little database over here that has everybody's social security numbers. Well, didn't know that. Need to know that, need to know it's valuable, need to keep it secure. Patch and update your systems. As I alluded to earlier, particularly in large complex organizations, that is a constant effort and you need to be on top of it. There are sometimes patches. Zoom is a great example of it. Came out, they've issued 2 or 3 different updates and patches for their system to protect against the security of people hacking into your video calls. So you need to be on top of that and keep installing that. Permissions management, knowing who has access, what they have access to, when they're accessing it, and how they're accessing it are very important in here. And you need to know that about your organization. And then finally, it's going to be an ongoing reframe, awareness and education. Develop ongoing education. You have to be continually training. The threats are changing, the education is training, people's awareness needs, the education needs to change, people's awareness needs to change. Next slide, please. So takeaway, evaluate your risk and implement best practices to protect within what's reasonable for your organization. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Diane, and she's going to talk a little bit more about cyber liability insurance and why it can matter. Diane?
Thank you, Amy. So we'll talk more about why cyber liability insurance matters. Next slide. So we've heard why it's so important to have risk management tools in place, and with cyber attacks on the rise, especially ransomware, I can tell you we've seen an uptick with clients with ransomware attacks, and it's never at a convenient time. It happens usually on the weekends, off hours, and then it creates a scramble as to what to do. And having cyber insurance liability is just one of the tools in the risk strategies of trying to minimize these exposures for clients. So let's talk a little bit more about what the policy does and how it all operates and why is it important. So generally, cyber liability insurance, it has two buckets, what we call first party expenses and coverages, and then third party, more of the liability coverages in place for defense costs and damages. And those first party expenses are there to lessen the financial impact, right? When there's expenses that have to be incurred immediately once you're trying to either assess whether there was an actual data incident or there was an actual breach, and then what would those costs entail in terms of dealing with that particular situation. And then of course, what is there to do now to restore data, restore systems, how to deal with lost business income, what if there's an actual ransomware demand, how to deal with the payment, to pay, not to pay, and extra expenses that may be incurred. And then the residual exposure of having maybe that third-party lawsuit, regulatory investigation, defense costs associated with dealing with an attack. So let's go to the next slide. So what I like about this slide, it just gives you, these are all the different clauses that you would find in a typical cyber policy, but they're not all of them, and they've expanded significantly. So we start with the left column, and we're still trying to figure out what happened. Is it really a data incident? Is it, or could it be an actual breach where there's now other responsibilities, and that could vary by state? And what if the records that were impacted impact multiple individuals in multiple states with multiple records? So there's all sorts of requirements, responsibilities associated with responding and looking at whether you had a data incident where maybe there was a lost laptop and one does not know yet whether the information was compromised, or if the information on that laptop necessarily had the number of records that would constitute some sort of state required notification, or was it an actual breach and now the clock starts ticking and there's real responsibilities in terms of notification. So this left side talks about having the experts on hand that you receive with the cyber policy to help you navigate what to do next. And we'll talk a little bit more about these services and these professionals and firms that come with your policy. Now, it's interesting, most policies have these predefined vendors that you can work with, but there are insurance policies that are available where perhaps you want to work with a very specific vendor, or that vendor is not on what they call their panel list of preferred pre-negotiate rated vendors, and that might be something to talk about with your broker at the front end when you purchase or consider the insurance. But these are for reimbursing services that you may now have to engage once you establish whether or not you had a data incident or a breach. And then we talked earlier about, it could be a ransom demand, there could be restoration costs associated with restoring the data, there is some ability to have system restoration, and then there could be business interruption or service disruption with your own system, or if there was a vendor disruption, how would that policy respond? And responding to those costs are important. And those are the majority of the costs that you see on the front end, and then during the process of resolving either an incident or a breach. But then you have those potential third-party liability situations where that now maybe there's a lawsuit that is brought, and there's now allegations of not securely taking care of members or participants or employees' personal information, health information. And if those third-party costs are associated with a particular breach, there's now the ability to have defense, potentially indemnity. There may be regulatory defense, fines, and penalties associated with a particular breach or situation. And those types of coverages are important to have. If you collect credit cards, there will be payment card responsibilities depending on the number of transactions. There's different levels. You have that network liability of the operating those systems, and then being potentially sued not only by employees or members or participants, but maybe by third parties or vendors that may have also suffered a breach. And then the media liability exposure associated with your content online. So there's quite a bit of coverage here. It really is nuanced, and we'll talk a little bit more of how that is impacted carrier by carrier. So let's talk at the next slide, and to go through a little bit more about, now there's an incident. What do we do? And we heard earlier the importance of an incident response plan. So your team is in place with their plan, and there is now an incident to review and respond to. There's also maybe potentially a cyber liability policy, right? Another tool in the toolbox to address. And now is the time to engage the carrier with their specialists, right? There could be incident response coaches. There's privacy counsel associated with these cyber policies. There could be a HIPAA coach. There could be security coaches. These are professionals that the carriers have engaged with by contract to help you ascertain whether or not you have a situation, whether your vendor situation is now impacting your data, or how do you deal with responding to an actual breach where notifications are required. And then all of a sudden, all these additional expenses, dealing with the forensics to understand what existed in the breach, or what was the cause and the scope of that particular incident. Maybe do you need to hire that particular public relations person or crisis management firm to help deal with messaging out the incident that occurred. And then, yes, if you do need to notify, and this is important too for the coverage, whether you have voluntary notification in that policy, where maybe you are required to notify in one state, but you may not be required to notify in another state, but it might be important for the entity to notify in all states, and having those costs covered are important. So, and then who to notify. And in some cases, you could have different letters that are required by legal to draft in multiple states, and communications may be required to look different, whether they're in print or whether on social media. So there's all sorts of nuances associated with dealing with notifying a breach. And then should you have to put in place a call center, for after hours, once the affected persons are notified about a situation, that script and those vendors who are equipped to handle those types of large or small number of calls is important to have in place. And the policy comes with all these services and comes with the ability to engage a response team. So then it's the process of, okay, what happens? Let's call the carrier, let's engage that breach coach. And now how do we work with our carrier? Do we have to put a claim in? And in some incidences, that you could have a carrier that might engage claims right on the phone at the time that they're calling you back after you've engaged them on that 800 number. So otherwise, there may just be privacy counsel, right, for protecting your rights before you have to maybe take another step. So it is important to know who's on the phone when you're calling in for that particular breach. So let's talk a little bit more, because privacy counsel and claims specialists on the next slide will help you formulate your response. Those are the front-end professionals that come in and help you ascertain whether or not now there is a response required to the state. What does the timing look like? what were the potential number of records that were impacted. Policies might have a number of records minimum, what we call deductible retention that might have to occur. So as long as it's more than maybe 100 records, then the policy will start responding. So number of records is also important because state by state, there's certain requirements of what you have to provide the state if you have an actual breach, and number of records, even possibly providing them a copy of the incident response plan. So there's documentation, and the legal counsel associated with these policies are experts in understanding what to do state by state. And then now perhaps there's an engagement with forensics to figure out what is the cause and the existence. I'll give you a quick example. We had a client who had a ransomware attack. They shut down the system, and the demand may be, thought of as minimal, $2,500. So whether to pay, whether not to pay, they worked with, law enforcement to figure out what was the best path of response. But it took weeks and months afterwards to ascertain whether or not these, hackers were still in the system. And there was over $400,000 in expenses associated with just trying to work with the forensics and outside vendors like accountants and IT professionals to extract this particular virus. And it could be quite costly. So something like that we talked about earlier doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cost less if you pay the ransom. And it can be just as costly when you do. So in this case, you also are now talking to professionals to decide, is it time to make a public statement? What would that public statement look like? Do we need to notify our customers, employees, participants, members? What's the right thing to do? Maybe there is no requirement based on the number of records or breach, but there may be costs associated that are ascertained as to why it makes sense to notify, and what would that look like. And we talked a little bit about those contracts with call centers and making sure those scripts are ready to go. Without the policy, without all these professionals in place, it could be very costly to figure that out as the clock is ticking, when you're in a crisis situation and all those types of professionals aren't readily available. Or they may have to be pre-vetted or pre-approved. So when you do look at a cyber policy, you can already receive the list of vendors that are associated with the policy. So it might be a good opportunity to look at who are those vendors in case there's a requirement of pre-approval, that it doesn't have to go at the time you're in the midst of a claim. And then if there's credit monitoring and identity theft required for X amount of months for a certain time period, that could be incredibly costly to clients. So these are all the steps that the Privacy Council and the claims specialist will help you ascertain, because there are questions then about how does the coverage operate. And you may think, well, if I put in a claim, will that be very detrimental to my insurance premiums? And it really depends. It's been a marketplace where there's been capacity and the willingness to renew clients that do have claims. So it's important to make sure that you understand how the policy operates. And your claims person will call you back. They give you a voice message that tells you exactly, how many hours before they call you back. And then it does vary by carrier. So these are all things that need to be thought about. Make sure the cyber policy and the 800 number becomes part of your incident response plan, or is in the hands of the individuals that are responsible to dealing with an incident or a breach. So we'll move to the next slide, because this is where it all kind of comes together. These policies are all written so differently. They do have the same intent, right? We talked about the first party coverages, we talked about the third party coverages, but they're so nuanced and they're usually labeled differently. What somebody might call a computer system might look something different on another policy. You know, how they talk about loss of income, or, you know, just their terms are so different. So really working with an insurance professional will help you ascertain what are the coverages I should have, what do I have, what don't I have. I can tell you, you know, over the years of underwriting and brokering the insurance coverage for cybersecurity, the product continues to change and develop, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. It's not constant. It changes rapidly. So let me give you an example. Now with the increase of ransomware attacks, we are now seeing ransomware applications. So you have your cyber application and then additional questionnaires, really honing in on the exposures associated with your protection of your system and the types of potential, you know, software attacks that can occur. We're seeing even carriers taking an approach maybe with different deductible structures for ransomware type attacks. And then, you know, there could be, you know, impacts to coverage and limits. So choosing the carriers is, you know, an important part of this process. And also, you know, the price obviously is a big part of, you know, how do you think about, you know, planning for the budget of cyber, you know, what is the cost? What is one policy cost? Maybe you'll buy a higher limit and that might, you know, require an additional carrier, or you may have a much larger layered program because of your size. And, you know, price is a big part of how, you know, these policies are structured. You know, with the increased attacks, we are seeing different, you know, rate increase structures coming through the marketplace, and it really depends on carrier by carrier. But it is a changing market and it can vary. And then you have this whole nuance of whether or not is cyber living in my cyber policy? Yes, that's, you know, that's the premise of that coverage. But where could it have other slivers of coverage? You know, is there a sliver in my property policy? How is my directors and officers liability policy maybe being impacted? You know, what are my crime coverages looking like? And do they, you know, coincide with my cyber policy? And all these types of policies are now being reviewed, and carriers, depending on their, you know, their own profit and losses in that space, may take different approaches on other lines of coverage. So again, while you're putting all the defenses in place to protect your systems and your data, you know, the policy does let you come in and transfer some of that risk. So let's talk a little bit more now on the next slide about where I get a lot of questions is, you know, what doesn't it cover? Because you talked about all these, you know, insuring clauses that give me first and third party, but it can't cover everything, right? So, you know, it's obviously not meant to cover some of the standard, you know, policies that are there, but there shouldn't be some exclusions in this marketplace where, you know, coverage has been broadened over the years, right? So, you know, exclusions for professional services, one can understand that's usually purchased through, you know, other types of policies, though there is media liability type coverages under most cyber policies, you know, with respects to, you know, the copyright infringement exposures and defamation associated with the information that's on you know, that's on the system or on the website and social media. But, you know, if there is, you know, there's obviously conduct exclusions, right? Criminal acts, right? You know, if an employee creates some sort of criminal act. Now, rogue employees, that has to be specifically, you know, defined in or addressed in the cyber policy. So, you know, look for those terms. We don't see too many exclusions for failure to follow minimum required practices. And you'll say, but that's the whole point. You know, maybe I don't follow the practices and something does occur or someone missed a step. So, you know, looking to make sure that that's not in the policy, that it could be removed or modified, you know, that no prior acts could potentially put a line in the sand to say that the coverage may not apply when you're not aware of something that could give rise to a claim. If there was a loss notified under a prior policy, another carrier or the carrier, does reserve the right not to cover it going forward. But you need to know how those carriers will respond if you decide to move and change carriers. Failure to implement or enforce adequate cyber measures. That's also one. If it's a failure to do something, and that was the premises of maybe buying some of that coverage, why is that exclusion in that policy? It may not be in that in all policies. So looking very carefully at these exclusions, trying to figure out what are the ones that maybe could be negotiated. I know there was one for a while, there was lack of clarity on portable devices. So everybody has portable devices, right? Board members come to these meetings with their own portable devices, and information is shared, and making sure that portable devices are electronics that are an affirmative grant of coverage. So I spent a little time on this because I think it's important to also look at what might not be covered. So let's talk a little bit more about how do I apply? So if this is the first time your organization or entity is applying for the insurance, there are very specific questions. And I talked about earlier that there's now even more questionnaires, right? There's one for ransomware that we're starting to see. There's one that's been out in the market for a while on social engineering, right? So being duped into releasing money, securities, and potentially other property. What are some of the checks and balances and the verification procedures, right? So in order to get those types of coverages, those applications mean something to the underwriters. They usually apply parts of those applications to their rating, and they charge, either debits or credits depending on the responses. So how cyber ready are you for that next opportunity to looking and evaluating insurance for this coverage? And these are some of the questions. Yes, is there an incident response plan? Now, these are questions, it depends on how in-depth that application is. You may say, well, I don't see some of these on some of these markets, but some carriers do still require some more in-depth questions around what incident response plan do you have in place? Are you building one, or is there one in progress? And if there are contracts in place with third parties and who are the hosts, there's questions about how information is stored, and how it's protected and how it's tested. Employees, who has access to data? What type of training? So that is on the next slide. So we're on the next slide where we're talking about already about who's responsible for the security data, how many employees. So these are your typical questions. It depends on the carrier again, how in depth those applications are. They vary depending on the market, but in this market condition, we are starting to see greater application process, like I said earlier, with ransomware questionnaires and social engineering. And carriers like to try to understand the number of records. I can tell you that that's one of the harder questions to answer, right? Because you're talking about the current records, you're talking about prior records, you're talking about paper records, you're talking about electronic records. So you can see how it starts to add up. So that is something that they try to better understand. And then depending on the policy you look at, there may be limits to the number of records for notifications. And some carriers just give you one big pot of money in terms of applying it to that particular limit of insurance. And then there's other carriers that say you have up to X amount of records, 250,000 or 500,000 or higher or lower, right? So knowing and understanding what that number of records is would be helpful. In some cases, depending on what type of organization, you're based on the rating on assets, revenues, on benefit plans, total contributions in general, depending on the carrier. And that all plays into what limits and retentions and coverages are then offered. And risk assessments are incredibly helpful, right? They give you an opportunity to step back and take a look at vulnerabilities and where there's areas for improvement. When I first started in the cyber insurance industry, risk assessments were the only way to get the actual insurance in place. And now it's good to know the clients actually have them and update them, and depends, again, if the carrier asks that question. Then, there's other questions about employee security training, right? Is that annual? Is that often? We heard earlier about all the ways these security breaches are happening, and human error continues to be on the top of the charts. So that training and testing happening often, and how is encryption being dealt with at the organization or at the entity level, and how often is that reviewed and tested? So all these types of questions, believe it or not, take multiple people to answer. So you'll be working with your IT and your human resources and finance and security teams to really try to ascertain, what are the carriers looking for, but they want to get a better understanding of what the basis of your protections are in place. If you do have a claim, which is very regularly, we have, clients that have claims, right? There's, I can give you an example, a couple of human error claims, right? Double stuffing envelopes with social security numbers on the, visible through the window of envelopes, right? Those are, some of those human error type situations, or where, a spreadsheet might have been inadvertently released, right, with PII or PHI information. So the carriers then, if you have the breach and you have the situation, really do want to understand, what protections you have, put in place going forward. So there's quite a bit of work that's done with the underwriters and the insurance professionals to help clients to really, address cyber and putting the coverage out to market. So let's do some takeaways here, because it is important to think about, when you're applying for the first time, what does it mean to look at the coverage? It's important to understand, if you're not buying the coverage, how are the protections going to help you deal with the costs associated, right, with dealing with the ransomware attack, or the social engineering, where it may have not been covered under the appropriate policies elsewhere, right? And social engineering is, something that is now a much more targeted, sophisticated attack that happens on a regular basis. And then ensuring that you have the right, functions and the right evaluations on your security and on your processes and procedures, and trying to implement those best practices. The insurance is just one part of the toolbox. It's an incredibly helpful tool to help clients. We do get feedback on the applications, and some of the feedback on the applications is, well, those are really good questions to think about. So if that's important to the underwriters, maybe we need to go back and reevaluate some of the processes and the procedures. So Amy, I'll turn it back over to you to finish up on the training. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. So in the interest of time, so we leave a little bit of time for questions, I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Next slide, please. So prevention and training, what you need to know is the numbers don't lie. Your biggest weakness is, in fact, the training and awareness of your employees, and you need to continually reinforce that training, as kind of the statistics here show. It really is a recipe for disaster if it's left unaddressed. Next slide, please. Common vulnerabilities should not be necessarily an unfamiliar list to you. We regularly see unpatched machines. We see unused accounts. Those are common issues. You need to constantly be having your IT reevaluate that, checking on that, keeping up with all of that. Next slide, please. Secure mobile devices. What I'll say is that people are going to bring them and use them. So you need to control the access. You won't be able to control the device itself or how they access, but you will be able to control how they get in the front door to your system to access that information. And that's what you need to be focused on with the secure mobile devices. Common password mistakes, very common. Probably the worst is writing it down. So I'm gonna skip this slide a little bit to get to the next slide. So we're on the world's most hacked passwords. These have been around a long time. Initially, everybody started. What I'm going to say is length is most important in a password, and that scares people a lot because they're going, I can't remember a super long password. I can't even remember my 6-digit password, and I have 20 different ones of them or more. However, the trick to this is create a phrase that is longer, but that you'll remember and change it every time, because one of the common password mistakes is you use the same password for every site because you can't remember 20 different passwords. But you use a phrase and you change it and you can remember what you did. So as the example, I have one here of 9 giraffes eat NCPERS trees. Obviously, the 9 giraffes eat trees is pretty long. It's easy for me to remember though. And I changed the NCPERS to whatever the organization or however I want to change it for all the different sites. So I have a unique long password that is easy for me to remember across the thing. And that is the key on the phrase. So the takeaway on training is train, train, train again. You know, continuously train your employees to avoid common mistakes. As I said earlier, the social engineering, the ransomware, the attacks are constantly changing. You need to keep training your employees and your whole organization to recognize and respond to those constant changes. So in summary, implement a security program. Ask about you and yourself, what is important to your organization. Fit it to your organization and understand what is valuable to you. Where is your data? What is the most valuable data? How do you recover? What are the essential functions you recover? And tailor it to fit you. A good security program is exactly that. It is tailored to fit your organization and is flexible to grow and change as your organization grows and changes. With that, we have about 2 minutes, my apologies, for questions, if anybody has questions for us.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Diane. So a couple of questions. So as you know, people who are tuning into this are plan trustees or staff or plan sponsors. As public sector entities, are they more at risk, less at risk, or about the same risk as just publicly traded companies or individuals?
Well, as I said early on in my presentation, 45% of public sector organizations globally have had an attack by ransomware. They are as likely, if not more likely now, because they have now become risen in the sight of hackers. And so they are a more likely target because once somebody figures it out, they have social security number, they may have credit cards, they have dates of birth, they have all sorts of protected identifiable information that can be used for a wide variety of activities. So they are becoming and rising to be a prime target.
Another question is, due to COVID, as more plans think about and implement more remote interactions using the internet and other platforms, what should they be thinking about? And are these remote platforms creating more touch points where hackers could get in?
Absolutely, the remote platforms are creating more touch points. We've all, well, I assume everybody's seen, the recent Zoom and the incidences where hackers came into particular Zoom meetings. You know, some of those meetings they just disrupted, but if you're talking about confidential information, if you're talking about those, you know, future plans for your organization, or, you know, what vendor you're going to select for an RFP process, that's critical information. Some of the best practices are making sure you know who's calling in. You know, initially people just left it open to anybody who had the connection could call in and get connected, and they weren't checking the list of participants. There's ways to always know who's called in, and if it's just a phone number, unless you recognize that phone number, you ask. There are ways to know who's talking. So again, if you watch kind of the participant thing on the side, usually it's on the side across the top, that person writes to relevance or priority on the video or whatever, so you know who's talking and you don't have to guess. We get in trouble when we trust that everybody who's on the call is supposed to be on the call. It's that whole social engineering issue. You know, we get into trouble then, and that's why you now have to kind of take attendance, check that you recognize all those phone numbers, do those things to protect yourself.
Last question is computer and server backups, are they an effective countermeasure to ransomware?
Yes, they are. Again, I noted earlier, 56% of the organizations restored their data after a ransomware attack from their backup. You should be though testing that those backups are actually occurring. We had one client who was saying, oh yeah, we have backups. When they went to do it, the backup was regularly failing and had been failing for 3 months and nobody had checked. So you need to check that your backups are working, that you can access them, that you can successfully restore from them. And the trick there though and back to Diane's, you know, talking about cyber liability and forensics, is going in and putting forensics to know how far back did that ransomware breach occur, because you don't want to be backing up to just reinstall the ransomware.
Mhm.
If they've been in there for 324 days for, as I said, for public sector organizations, you need to go pretty far back to restore it. And then you have to move forward from a clean version. So there's complications there. They're overcome. I mean, you can overcome them.
Great. Amy, Diane, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation today. To the audience, thank you for joining us. Join us on Thursday for our next webinar entitled ESG, Why Are We Still Talking About This? Have a good afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Yeah.
You.
Take care. Bye-bye.